Have you ever just stopped and wondered, how did we get here? I don't just mean you and me. I mean all of this. Our cities, our governments, the way we even think about the world. Well, today, we're taking a high-speed trip through thousands of years of history to find the moments that really mattered, the massive turning points that literally forged the world we live in right now. So buckle up.
Here's a wild thought. What if everything about our modern lives, everything, really boils down to just a handful of revolutionary moments, a few seismic shifts that change the game completely? That's the huge question we're diving into, tracking those critical points where history took a sharp turn and never looked back.
All right, so our story has to start with the very first, and you could argue the biggest revolution of them all.
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but for almost all of human existence, our lives were defined by one single thing. We were always on the move.
Just look at this timeline for a second. It's pretty staggering, right? For 99% of the time humans have been on this planet, we were hunter-gatherers. That means everything we think of as civilization, cities, writing, countries, the phone in your hand, it's all just a tiny sliver at the very end. It just goes to show you how new all of this really is. This right here, this really lays out the two completely different worlds. On one side, you've got a life that's a constant hunt, always following the food. And on the other, you have this totally radical new idea. Hey, what if we just stayed put? That leap from a life of constant motion to a life of permanence was the first massive disruptor in the human story.
So the big takeaway here is that the Neolithic Revolution wasn't just about learning how to plant seeds. It was about creating something that had never existed before, a surplus of food. And with extra food, everything changes. For the very first time, not everyone had to be focused on finding the next meal. Some people could become builders, or toolmakers, or leaders. And right there, that's where you get the seeds of everything that follows. Specialization, social classes, property, and yeah, even organized warfare. It's the bedrock of civilization.
Okay, let's jump forward to our next big turning point. Once we settle down, the next revolution wasn't about food, it was about ideas. You can basically think of the ancient Greeks and Romans as the people who wrote the original intellectual software for Western civilization, an operating system we are, in many ways, still running today.
And think about it, it's so true. Our modern political debates, they're full of echoes from Athenian democracy. Our courtrooms, they're built on the scaffolding of Roman law. Even the pillars on our government buildings are trying to look like the Parthenon. These aren't just dead ideas from dusty old books. They're the living blueprint for so much of our world. And that software got a chance to be installed everywhere, thanks to something called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For over 200 years, the Roman Empire created this huge, stable zone, like a giant incubator. This long period of peace meant that those classical ideas about government, law, and philosophy could spread and take root all across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, creating a kind of shared cultural DNA.
But what happens when a system that powerful and stable just breaks? Well, the fall of Rome in 476 AD was a cataclysm. It threw Europe into a long period of chaos and fragmentation. But out of those ashes, a totally new world with a completely different rulebook eventually began to emerge.
You see, with the central power of Rome gone, this new system, feudalism, popped up to fill the void. This diagram shows you that rigid pyramid of power. Society wasn't based on being a citizen anymore. Nope, it was all about personal loyalty and obligation. A lord protects his people, and in return, they fight for him. It was a messy, dangerous, and very hierarchical world.
And then the Renaissance happened. It literally means rebirth, and that's exactly what it was, a rebirth of all those classical ideas from Greece and Rome. But this time, something was different. There was a new piece of tech that was an absolute game changer, the printing press. All of a sudden, these powerful old ideas could be copied and spread like wildfire, shifting Europe's focus away from just the divine and onto human potential. And that idea, that humans matter, was the spark that lit the fuse for the next age of revolution.
Okay, so this is where the pace really starts to pick up. A lot. If the ancient world wrote the code and the Middle Ages kind of hit the pause button, the next few centuries were like a series of massive, chaotic system updates happening all at once. This is where the modern world was truly forged in fire.
First up, the scientific revolution. Now, this was way more than just new discoveries about planets and gravity. It was a totally new way of knowing anything at all. For the first time, humanity started to trust what it could actually see, test, and measure, instead of just accepting what ancient authorities had written down. And that way of thinking turned out to be incredibly powerful.
And of course, that powerful new way of thinking immediately spilled over into politics. The logic was pretty simple, right? If we can question the eternal truths about the universe, then why on earth can't we question the idea that some king has a divine right to rule over us? The American and French revolutions took that logic and ran with it, tearing down the old world of kings and subjects and building a radical new one, a world of citizens, of rights, and of nations.
And as if that wasn't enough, at the exact same time, another revolution was totally transforming daily life. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how we made stuff, it fundamentally changed where we lived and how we worked, pulling millions of people out of the fields and cramming them into new, booming cities to work in factories. The whole structure of society was being rewritten, fast. This motto from the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, it just perfectly captures the explosive energy of this entire era. Liberty from absolute rulers, equality under the law, and a sense of brotherhood in a new kind of community, the nation. These weren't just words, they were world-changing ideas that would spread across the entire planet.
And this chart just shows you the sheer scale of that change from the Industrial Revolution. In just over 100 years, humanity went from being a species that was 80% rural to one that was majority urban. That is an insane demographic shift. This wasn't just people moving houses, it was a complete rewiring of society itself, all driven by the power of the steam engine.
Okay, let's get into our final section, which brings us crashing into the 20th century. You can think of this as the moment where all those powerful forces we've been talking about, fierce nationalism, incredible industrial power, and clashing ideologies, all collided with absolutely terrifying results. This was truly an age of extremes.
World War I was a horrifying shock to the system. All of that amazing industrial power that had built skyscrapers and railroads was now turned to a single purpose: killing on an industrial scale. The result was a kind of carnage the world had never seen before. 16 million people dead. Just let that number sink in.
And then, barely 2 decades later, it happened again. But this time, it was so much worse. World War II was a truly global war that mobilized entire societies for total conflict. The death toll is almost incomprehensible: 75 million people. It was the devastating and brutal climax to this modern age of extremes.
Now, after the absolute horror of 2 world wars, you'd think humanity would be ready for a break. But no. Instead, we got the Cold War. For almost half a century, the entire planet was split in two. On one side, you had the capitalist and democratic West, on the other, the communist East, which championed totalitarianism, a system where the state has, or tries to have, total control over everyone's life. And the whole time, the threat of nuclear war hung over everyone's head.
The moment the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 felt like the symbolic end to that long, violent, and terrifying century. But just as that chapter was closing, a brand new one was opening up. The end of the Cold War happened right as the internet was being born, kicking off a digital revolution that would, once again, change absolutely everything.
So, we've seen how a few massive turning points completely changed the human story, from the very first farmer who decided to stay put, to the thinkers of Athens, to the dawn of the internet. Every revolution has reshaped our world, which of course brings us to right now. What do you think is the great turning point of our time? What new revolution are we living through, and where do you think it's all going to lead?